in Kashmir, stoking the flames of possible nuclear war with Pakistan. That's what we commend. Or maybe a Chinese person getting up in Tiananmen Square and standing up against the regime.
Yes, thanks.
When did that last happen?
Nuclear power just do whatever it likes and threaten nuclear war.
Are you using that word can in the moral sense, or just can in terms of...
I don't know.
Well, that's what Putin's doing right now. Vladimir Putin is using nuclear weapons. He is.
Satan too.
He's
Satan
not
too.
dropping them. He's not detonating them on any country. But
No, he dropped it in
he's
Russia.
putting them in the
Yeah.
Baltics, right? That is a use of nuclear weapons.
He tested.
If you look at the bulletin, of atomic scientists and what they've written about the threat of nuclear war, we're at 2 minutes to midnight. They're also factoring in threats like the pandemic, like climate change, which is the biggest long-term threat facing us. But the biggest short-term threat is definitely nuclear weapons.
I reckon
All those people that are trying to escalate the war in Ukraine, they are playing with nuclear fire, is what they're doing. They're playing with the possible outcome. If you compare us to the situation in Cuba in 1962, we're in a much worse state today. Back then, we had leaders like JFK and Khrushchev. These men are far more level-headed, analytical, reasonable men than Putin and Biden are. Okay, that's the situation we're in now. And yes, people say, "Oh, nuclear war, it's not going to happen." Oh, because look at the amount of times it's never happened. We've only ever dropped 2 nuclear bombs on a city, right? Which was
2 cities.
an example of American terrorism.
2 bombs, 2 cities.
American state terrorism against another country, right? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, 2 ways around it. So they say, well, we haven't dropped any since on any city, so nuclear war is not going to happen. But if you actually have a look at the record, if you have a look at the list of nuclear incidents that could have led to nuclear war, it's hair-raising material, my friends. It really is. And it should make you think about whether or not you want to escalate this conflict in Ukraine or try and de-escalate it with
What do you
negotiations.
suggest?
What do I suggest?
What do you just suggest?
Well, with regard to Ukraine,
Well,
I'd say I think as much as possible, Britain should join France and Germany in pushing for a negotiated settlement with Putin. We shouldn't be trying to funnel as many weapons in
You
there as
mean
possible.
appeasement? That's what you mean, really.
Appeasement?
Yes. That's exactly what I mean.
Appeasement of whom? Of Putin?
Yeah.
Appeasement of Putin. You need to appease Putin in this situation.
That's why he's advocating.
This is an attempt to mudsling. I can see it clearly. Anybody who knows anything about World War II, anybody who knows anything about World War II can see this as an attempt to sling mud. I can see that now, right now.
I mean, people try to appease Hitler by not
Yeah,
doing anything
I
about
would even
his
go far.
expansion.
Talking about Hitler, Britain didn't just appease Hitler during World War II or just prior to World War II. Britain actually collaborated actively with Hitler.
No, they
People
did
know this.
business with him.
Not just that. No, not just that.
Really collaborate with
Not
the
just that.
extermination.
There's the example I've read about Michael Parenti, the historian spoken about World War II. Michael Parenti points to how Britain had a very, very clear opportunity to get rid of Hitler and they refused to take it. Because right at that point, they weren't sure whether they should back Hitler and trying to keep the communists at bay, or whether he would end up being a threat to Britain, in which case they'd have to support
Well,
the communists.
communism was
The
aggressive.
Wehrmacht actually, the Wehrmacht actually came to Britain. The Wehrmacht came to Britain and they said, we don't want to get into another war. Germany is not ready to fight another war. It wasn't that they disagreed with Nazi ideology per se, it's just they didn't want Germany to fight and lose another war. They said, if we get your help, if we get the help of British intelligence services, we can get rid of Hitler with an assassination if need be.
But wait a
And the
second.
British chose not to take that
because
opportunity.
Wait, but
saw
isn't that
communism
the
as a
British
greater
chose-
Hold
threat.
on, Kyle. But
Not
does
that we should assassinate
doesn't that just contribute to the argument we're making right now? Because hold on, you're saying that we should not do more. You call it escalation. We should not do anything else about the Ukraine situation. We should not escalate. Blah blah blah. Fair enough. But you're saying they should have assassinated Hitler.
I'm not saying that necessarily. I'm just pointing at an example of collaboration, right? Maybe it's a bit of a tangent. I'm just pointing out that this appeasement is another classic English euphemism for actual collaboration. The fact that they did nothing and they had the opportunity means more or less they were helping Hitler. And let's not forget that Britain helped Mussolini when he was writing anti-communist pamphlets. MI5 was putting Mussolini on Britain's payroll, about £100 a week he was getting in sterling at the time. If you read Peter Day's book, Franco's Friends, Britain helped Franco get to power in Spain. Britain, like you said, has no friends or enemies, only interests. Britain was happy to work with the Putin stooge Yanukovych in Ukraine. I pointed this out again and again. This is history that needs to be discussed in the media. £1 million worth of weapons.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what we're saying.
£1 million worth of weapons sold to Yanukovych. Sniper rifles, weapon sights. These were weapons that he then used in Euromaidan Square to assassinate protesters. There are still protesters in Ukraine missing from that event. All right? Britain was happy to actively collaborate with a wannabe dictator like
But hold
Yanukovych.
on a second. You
So
know,
I'm
at that
pointing out
point,
this fundamental reality. We have no
when they
friends
were
or enemies,
selling
only
those
interests.
weapons,
Now this
there was
applies.
no
This
hint
applies to the
of
British
proof.
elite.
There
This
was no hint of
applies-
proof. They
hold
would
on
be
a
used to
second.
oppress the
I'm still
Ukrainian
responding
people.
to something Robert asked me earlier. This applies to
Not
the British
exactly.
elite.
You're on a tangent now.
This applies to the British elite. The idea that we have no friends or enemies or only
He's
interests.
gonna use you as a
British
as a way of
people,
getting out of the
they of
discussion.
course have friends. They of course see civilians in Ukraine and they feel solidarity with them. British people remember when that 5-year-old Syrian boy washed up on the shores of the Mediterranean, the dead body, and they felt an outpouring of grief and remorse for that. They do remember this. British people have a tremendous sense of sympathy for civilians in other countries. It's true. However, sorry?
But he can't go. He has no military experience. They're not letting people. They're- Teach him. I don't have any military experience. What am I gonna teach him? How to box and go with his fist to Ukraine?
Hold on,
not a
I've
good argument.
heard
Before the
some
war.
leftists, which I really admire usually.
Of course you do. You're a leftist. It's the truth.
People like, what was her name? I remember reading one leftist journalist, independent blogger journalist. She said, well, if you support escalating the war in Ukraine so much, why don't you go and fight in Ukraine? No, that's not an argument. I'm sorry, that's not an argument.
No, but he's joking.
There are
He's
much-
joking. He's joking.
I don't know if he's joking. A lot of people
said
saying
he was
this.
joking,
Oh, if you
right?
support the Ukraine war so much, why don't you go and fight there? No, I'm sorry. You
Because he
can
has no
support the war from here.
military
There are much more
They
sound
won't let
reasons
him
for
in. They'll
supporting the
turn
war
him back
here.
at the border.
Namely, Ukraine's
I
right
know.
to
I researched
self-defense.
it. I tried to go myself. They would not accept it. This is important, actually.
You can be a cook.
Me or Kyle or anybody, we cannot go to the Ukrainian war because we have no military experience, and they're not allowing people with zero military experience cross the border and go there. Huh? They allow people. They allow people with experience to go in. No, that's fine. It's fine. It's fine. You keep there. No,
All
they're-
of- I'd say
They're
if
not-
you
they're
asked my
not
position on this, you asked me earlier, it's very close to the
They're not
campaign
gonna let
against
them
the arms
fight.
trade position. We should be trying to do as much as possible to save Ukrainian civilians, and we shouldn't be trying to escalate the war by funneling weapons, funneling in arms to a country that has no arms controls. Ukraine is one of the centers for international illegal arms dealing. I think this could end up in the wrong hands. We've seen how American-made weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS. We've seen how that happened in the Middle East, where ISIS managed to get hold of weapons. No, it could even be Russian-backed. It could even be Russian-backed forces that get hold of
yeah, like
weapons.
Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah,
It's
how are
pretty
you gonna
similar
stop
to
Putin?
ISIS.
We don't know.
That's
for
a good
sure.
question.
What do you mean you don't know?
How are you going to
The
solve the
solution to stop
problem?
Putin, I think, as much as possible, negotiate a settlement, trying to follow the Minsk Accords, which both the central government of Ukraine and the Russian-backed forces failed to follow. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and follow them. For example, we have the Genocide Convention in Britain. Now, Britain has failed to uphold that Genocide Convention multiple times. That doesn't mean Britain shouldn't be pushed to try and uphold that convention. In 1994, the Rwandan genocide took place, partly as a result of British crimes of omission. The British elites did everything they could to not get that genocide labeled as a genocide in the United Nations Security Council because they didn't want to have to intervene under the Convention on Genocide. They didn't want to. Now, does that mean the Convention of Genocide is a bad thing and that we shouldn't uphold it? Of course not. It's a good idea. The idea that the great powers, the United States Security Council members, Britain, France, America, Russia, China, should do everything they can to stop genocide. And Britain did nothing in that genocide, next to nothing.
Yeah, the one who's doing the genocide all the time.
We weren't doing the genocide, but we were actively getting a green light to the
But there is a
genocidaires to keep
genocide
going.
going on in Ukraine right now, and you're claiming Britain should not do anything about it.
Can anybody say that that's what I said? Does anybody here actually think
Hold
that's
on,
what
wait,
I
wait,
said?
wait. Let me.
Does anybody here agree with Pavlov
but wait,
that that's
let
what
me
I just said?
articulate
That I
that.
said we shouldn't do anything to help people in
Do you
Ukraine.
want me to explain
Anybody
my
who
point?
said no?
You don't want me to explain? Okay, fine. I
Sorry?
won't explain my point.
With weapons. Would you help them with weapons? The Ukrainian
Oh, I've
people.
just said I think we should be very concerned about sending weapons into a country
Then
that
that's
has
doing
no arms
nothing.
control.
That's doing nothing about the genocide.
Sorry?
Say that from a very peace position, but if an army is walking on you, marching on you, it is self-defense, is it not?
No, he's framing it correctly.
Vladimir Putin, Adolf Hitler, these are all people who claim they wanted peace, okay? Right? That's not, everyone here wants peace. Even Putin wants peace on his terms, right? Fine. He's not interested in killing people for the sake of killing people.
Yeah, he wants peace of Ukraine, I know.
Of course.
Piece of Ukraine.
So
Piece of
No,
Ukraine.
we
when
have to
everybody's
examine
dead.
the British
That's
role
what he
in provoking
wants.
that response. Does it justify the criminal barbaric invasion? No, it doesn't. But should we not examine the factors that led to this state of affairs? People like Henry Kissinger have been warning, and George Kennan, high up level strategic planners in the United States, have been warning for decades that trying to turn Ukraine into an American client state would provoke a Russian response that would lead to war. I'm not just quoting radical leftists here. This is Henry Kissinger himself who was helpful in creating genocides
about
in places
Estonia
like Vietnam.
and Latvia
All right, he's
didn't
not exactly
create
a
this
radical
problem?
Absolutely.
leftist.
Why Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, which are closer to Russia and are part of NATO for 15, 20 years,
Absolutely.
why didn't it create this problem?
Absolutely.
Why Ukraine does, and why those countries
That's a good
they don't
question.
create the problem?
Okay, there's
I think
two
we are
reasons
going
for that.
into a new geopolitical moment
There's
of the
two
world,
reasons for that.
and there are many reasons, and you cannot
That's a
only
very good question.
find
I like
one
that question.
solution and blame it on one. I think everybody has a part. The Americans,
Yeah.
Europeans, and Putin. Okay,
I respect this. This is you made not just a good question, but a good analysis as well. We've all had a part to play in this.
Estonia is 200
right.
kilometers from St. Petersburg.
Okay, first of all,
you drive in 2 hours.
I'll give you two
are in
reasons.
St. Petersburg.
I'll give you two reasons. It's the quantity. First of all, when a certain number of states gets to a certain level, then it maybe is more likely to promote a response. The second likelihood is that Ukraine is far more geostrategically important than any of those states you mentioned.
Is it?
Ukraine has historically been the site for multiple invasions into Russia. Ukraine has a very flat land, very easy to travel through. Ukraine, for Russia's own imperialistic reasons, they took Ukraine after World War II for what they said was a buffer state, as a protection against the Nazis. For me, I think that's just Russian propaganda rhetoric. I think they just wanted Ukraine because it's a very valuable
It's the
asset to
same
have.
thing then.
It could be a bit of both. Some people say it's a bit of both. For example, Germany right now wants to push for negotiations with Putin, right? So does
They need
France.
the Russian gas.
You say it's because of the Russian gas.
It is.
I think that could be a very good reason why. I wouldn't be surprised. The other thing is I think they do care about Ukrainian civilians. They want to put an end to this war as soon
Do
as
they?
possible.
Germans care about Ukrainian civilians.
Analysts like Anatol Yevin, who's an expert on places like Afghanistan, Ukraine, hotspots of conflict. People like Noam Chomsky, well-respected public intellectuals, whether you disagree with them or not on different issues. I disagree with Chomsky on a number of things. They've all pointed out
Never heard any of
that
those.
this war will end in either one of two ways. It'll end in either destruction of one side by another, or it will end with a negotiated settlement.
Right.
And I have to say, tragically, I don't think Ukraine is the one that's more likely to destroy Russia than the other way around. I think just looking at the balance of power, this doesn't justify Putin at all. Just examining the balance of power in
I
this
think you
situation.
should rather look at
Now,
the,
someone accused me of appeasement. I
way
just want to
the war
address
is
a point. Accused me of appeasement. Well, if you want to call it appeasement, that's fine. Personally, I am happy to appease someone with a finger on the nuclear button who has more than the most amount of nuclear weapons in the world. If appeasing them means stopping them using nuclear weapons, and stopping them killing civilians in Ukraine, call me an appeaser, fine.
Okay,
I don't
so
mind.
hold on. You would allow a
Putin
genocide
is a
to
lot more
happen.
dangerous than
You
Adolf
would
Hitler.
allow a genocide
Vladimir
to happen.
Putin is a far
You
more
would
dangerous
allow a
figure than
genocide to
Adolf Hitler
happen
was.
if the person who's committing the genocide
Allow
is
genocide to
threatening. And there's no genocide in Ukraine, isn't there? You sure of that?
I'm sure there's a genocidal war going on. It's of
But there was
course.
also
Well, there we go.
genocide
Then
in
you,
Donbass, in Iraq,
you're
in
trying to get the
Afghanistan.
West out of helping
I just said
Ukraine,
I'm not.
who's suffering
I'm
a
not.
war of
I'm
genocide
not.
from Russia.
Look, my friend,
Yes, you are. You're-
Pavlov, you're a good friend of mine, but I say this to you every single week.
That's irrelevant
If you
to
want
the
to have a
discussion.
conversation with a lamppost behind me, which is what you're doing right now, then fine, go ahead and do it. I'm here.
This
I've
is
just
ad hominem,
said,
Kyle. This
I've
is
just
ad
said
hominem
that the
and you know it.
West has a really big role to play in
This is
here
ad hominem
in
and you
terms
know
of
it.
pushing for a negotiated settlement.
And
That
you
is
didn't
not
answer my
That
question.
is not saying getting the West out of Ukraine. All right. I also am
Nobody
here
said
not to
getting
just.
the West out of Ukraine. You're claiming
I'm
the West
also
should not
here
provide
not just to
Ukraine with
promote
weapons
solutions.
that the Ukrainians need to defend themselves
I
from the
promote
Russian
Ukrainian
invasion.
right of self-defense. Even the campaign.
But you're saying the
Even
West
the
should not
campaign
provide
against the
Ukraine
arms
with
trade
weapons we
supports that
need
position.
for our
The
self-defense.
campaign against the arms trade says we should support Ukraine's
Do
right
you
to
think
self-defense.
the West should not provide
All
weapons
they're
for
doing,
Ukraine?
all they're doing is raising
Simple
concerns
questions.
about sending weapons to a country that has no
Well,
arms
simple
controls,
question. Do you think
which might lead
do
to
you think
another
the West should
situation
not
like what
provide
happened
Ukraine with
with
weapons?
ISIS. When ISIS got a hold of weapons,
Do you think
that were
the
made by
West should
Britain,
not
made by
provide
America.
Ukraine with weapons? You think the West
I
should
do
not
I do
provide
not
Ukraine
think we
with
should be
weapons?
escalating the war. I do not think we
No,
should
no.
be sending
Do you
weapons.
think the West
Other
should?
just answered your
Do you
question.
think the West should or should not provide
answered
Ukraine
like
with
5 of your
weapons?
questions.
You have not answered
I
any.
just said I think they should stop sending them.
There's
There
some
we
people
go,
that
thank
you
you.
cannot
Now for
negotiate
argument.
with, or some people that have so outlandish terms that it would be futile to try and appease these people.
Absolutely.
Do you think that Putin you can't negotiate with him, and some of his terms you cannot appease? He cannot just nick pieces of land that he wants.
Putin is not senile, for one thing. I'm not here to try and psychoanalyze Putin, try and give, like a lot of the media have done, calling him autistic, calling him this. He's impossible to negotiate with, he's power hungry, power mad. Clearly, Putin has made some serious errors. He surrounded himself with maybe 20 people, which is maybe 10 times less than the usual number of people he deals with, right? And because of coronavirus restrictions and his paranoia about coronavirus, he doesn't want to have. He wants to stop social distancing. He doesn't want to have people around him.
He's a psychopath.
So he's done what Tony Blair and George Bush did in the run-up to Iraq. He's listening to the yes men who agree with his prejudices, right? Then he made terrible errors. He attacked from 6-7 different directions with too few troops. The guy is clearly not a military genius, right? Having said that, he is very dangerous. There's no doubt about it. So now you have to ask yourself, if he is a dangerous lunatic, right, who's willing to lash out when he's backed up against the wall, right, willing to escalate, are you sure that provoking him further is the right response?
As it says in the article, you've got to build him a golden bridge to retreat from. If he's so dangerous, to push him into a corner. Yeah.
No, you can use heroic rhetoric. You can say, no, we can't negotiate with terrorists. We can't do that. We have to fight to the last Ukrainian. We can say all kinds of propaganda slogans. It's fine. Go ahead. Those are very cheap, my friends. Very cheap.
What are you doing? Nobody's saying that. What are you doing, Kyle?
I said you can. I didn't say you were doing it. Just relax.
But why are you? I'm very
You're being
relaxed.
very narcissistic. You're making this whole meeting about you
Kyle,
and your beliefs.
Hold on.
I'm talking about a kind of currency
right
of beliefs that's
to
happening in our current
and you're
affairs.
using
You're saying
dominance
fighting to the
refuse
last
to
Ukraine.
engage to any
Listen, my friend,
questions
this is
I'm
not a
giving
debate
you.
just between you and me. This is a discussion.
It's a
between the whole
debate
audience.
between you and every
Yeah,
single
my
person
friend.
around
If
here.
anybody here wants to keep listening to just Pavlov, I'm happy to get up on my ladder. I'm happy to have him listen. But I'm having a discussion with everybody.
But all the arms they're receiving so far is all defense. They haven't got airplanes or things, to attack.
No, the
Russia.
Ukrainians, maybe rightly, are calling for a no-fly zone, right, over Ukraine. Now, personally, that could be also I'm not sure about that one. I've heard Ukrainians say that's very dangerous. I've heard Ukrainians saying that's very positive, it would save us, that we need to involve... but having that could possibly lead to a nuclear confrontation. Similar situations have happened in Iran before, when there was a no-fly zone in the 80s. There was a threat by the Russians. They said they were willing to use nukes in that conflict.
Again, you have
If you
to
look
be,
at the record of how so often both America and Russia have used nuclear weapons in negotiations, you'd be astounded. You have Kissinger threatening to use them in Vietnam. You have Russia, like I gave you the example, using them in the 80s, threatening them against Iran. It's a common recurrence. It's not talked about in the media enough because they don't want to draw attention to our own role in that. We have 250 nuclear warheads in this country. Now, that's not enough to just wipe out the entire planet, but that is enough to wipe out a whole continent, cause a nuclear winter that could kill 1 billion people.
It's enough to
all right?
start a nuclear war.
This is just not on the table. It's just not a possibility. It's like I was at an Extinction Rebellion demo yesterday, and they endlessly talk about climate change, and that's right. It's a big threat. But I hardly ever hear young people talk about nuclear weapons. It feels like it's the older generations who talk about that. The sort of boomers who had to do duck and cover. You had to deal with the Cold War rhetoric. They were the ones who actually are more savvy on this. I don't hear younger people talking about this terrible risk.
Can you have it both ways? That Putin is a maniac that's willing to use nuclear weapons, and also he's a reasonable guy that we can negotiate with.
No, you can't. Those are contradictory ideas. All right?
Isn't that what you're saying?
No. I was talking about the rhetoric about Putin. All right. Look, just remember, Donald Trump said in the negotiations in North Korea, all options are on the table. All right. We had Tony Blair coming out of his coffin to say we should put a NATO intervention on the table. All right, these are all like, there's no words for this. The word that I think that most captures the threat of nuclear weapons is omnicide. Omnicide. Maybe beetles and cockroaches would survive after something like this. All right, all right, but that's not us. I don't think humans will survive.
But the question is,
sorry,
who benefits from
again,
this?
you
Can I say your question second?
Who benefits from this? There must be somebody who benefits. And that's where you have the
Look,
solution.
this is an
like oil companies, weapon manufacturers, they're laughing at us.
This is an
And we're in
imperialist
fear.
conflict between the United States Empire and the Russian Empire, and Ukraine is being used as a
Empire
battlefield.
I
All
agree
right,
with that.
this is not a
That's
war against
totally
Ukraine
right.
and Russia. This is a war against Russia and the United States with Ukraine as a
Between
battlefield.
Ukraine and
where
Russia.
Ukrainian civilians are lost in the sea of heroic rhetoric. All right, about how we should stand up to the vile Russian bear. That's what it comes down to. Ukrainians are pawns, just like the Afghans, just like the people in
they're being
Yemen,
used.
just like people in
Exactly
Libya. Now, I've heard people say I'm anti-West, anti-NATO, anti-British. No, this is another slur. No, I'm not anti-British. I'm not. It's just mudslinging. And the problem is when you throw shit, it does stick, right? You can't. It's hard to just wipe it off because once it's sown that, it gets
It
into
sticks,
someone's
especially
mind.
if it's true.
It gets into someone's mind. Shit isn't true. All right, this shit isn't true.
Well,
I'm
when
not
you're talking
anti-West.
shit, people will
I'm
talk
not
shit about
anti-British.
you, Kyle.
The majority of British people would not have been okay with Britain selling £1 million worth of weapons, sniper rifles, weapons scope to Yanukovych to use against the Ukrainian people. The British people would not have been okay with that. But do the British people know about this? Was this debated in the media? Do you know how long I had to dig into Ministry of Defense records, Hansard,
You didn't dig enough,
independent
because
media
clearly you don't
to
know
find
what
that
that money
information?
went for.
To
That
find
money
that
went
information?
went for many
Do you know how
different
long
things,
it took
not
me
just
to
sniper
research that?
rifles.
This is what I do. This is what I do at Speaker's Corner. Is I take time to research the stuff,
You
come to
don't do
Speaker's
it well
Corner and
enough.
share it.
You don't have the research.
Now, British people, would they have been okay with that? I don't think so. I don't think British people personally would be happy for Britain to be selling £1 million worth of weapons to a wannabe dictator like Yanukovych. Democratically elected as he was still an authoritarian. I don't think British people would be okay with that.
He
I think
wasn't
I think
authoritarian
this
at
is a
that
problem
point
of the
yet.
British elite. The British elite have this mentality that it's okay to do that. That it's okay to sell weapons to the King of Thailand. That it's okay to sell weapons to Vladimir Putin, no less. People don't know, but again, another fact people don't know about.
You're spreading
After
misinformation,
Skripal-
Kyle. You're spreading misinformation.
After Skripal's attack, where Britain accused Russia of having killed a British person on British soil, Britain continued to sell millions of pounds worth of military equipment to Russia. We got to remember, even an article in the Daily Mail admitted this. Now they were doing this to bash the Labour Party. They weren't doing it for good reasons, but they were right to point out Britain helped Putin get into power. Head of MI6 came out. So John Dearlove, the ex-head of MI6,
Helped Putin
he said
get into power.
he said my biggest regret of my career was that I helped Vladimir Putin get to power. That I advised Tony Blair and his wife Cherie Blair to go to the opera with Putin, even though human rights organizations in Britain were calling for Tony Blair to stop helping Putin as he was massacring people in Chechnya. I've been speaking about this for years at Speaker's Corner, that Britain was complicit in that genocide against the Chechens. Now maybe the Chechens matter less because they're Muslims than the Ukrainians.
Oh,
Maybe
here we go.
Maybe
Here
that's
we
how it
go.
is. I don't know. Maybe that's the attitude
Here
of the
we
media.
go. Here we go.
Maybe when Putin genocides the Chechens, it's not as big of a problem.
You know, I spoke
I don't
about the
know.
Chechens plenty of times. If you didn't hear that, then you've been deaf. So every single time that I spoke about it.
Can I just tell you, you're amazing.
Amazing.
Can I just tell you, there are no females here.
Yeah.
What the fuck is with everyone?
Do you want to do a speech?
No, no.
Well, that's exactly why there's no females here. When we ask them to speak, they don't want to speak.
No, I've got nothing
Come
in
on,
general.
that's why there's no
I
females.
love
This is why
it.
there's no females.
But that's,
You have to say
that's why
something.
that's why there's no females. You gotta come here and
That's
speak.
true. I have nothing that interesting to say at the moment, but I agree.
Well, there you go. You know, that's why there's no females.
Okay.
Again,
Yeah, bring your sisters. Bring your wives.
don't bring your wife.
bring
no.
your mothers,
Don't
bring
bring
your
your
daughters.
mothers. No. People will start making your mama jokes here, and then you know it goes down the
No,
drain.
I
from
think
that
one
point.
reason why women don't come here is because this is a very competitive space. It's very like,
Well, yeah, basically.
instead of having a discussion where you're learning from someone who might disagree, it often turns into a pissing contest. I'm not saying it's happening now. It's not really happening. I've had much worse than this.
It's always happening.
And I don't
between
think women
us.
like that. I have to say. So if we want to encourage women to come, we got to stop doing that. You want to ask something? Sorry, you want to ask something? You want to ask something?
You said this war will end up with negotiations, yeah?
Always they do.
Should. I said it
Always.
should.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the only way to solve it.
Yeah,
Negotiation.
but you have to be in strong position to negotiate with
Yes. But
the kind of Putin, you know? If you are not in strong position,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
You're
the
gonna
Americans,
lose it
we're in
anyway.
an incredibly strong position. The NATO budget is like 10 times more than the Russian military budget, okay?
who cares?
You should get an idea of there is a balance of power which Putin has in terms of nuclear weapons. But in terms of his military successes, we've seen he's not a capable military leader. All right? He's not a threat to Finland or Sweden.
Isn't
All
he?
right? He's made a massive misjudgment. He's driven those
Okay,
countries.
this is a new one.
He has driven those countries into NATO's arms. He's made a big error. He thought that somehow the West would be divided over
Here
this.
we go. He's scared those countries to join NATO because they don't want to be invaded by Russia.
I know.
So how
Again,
are you blaming
I don't know why
NATO
I'm
in
agreeing.
this?
I'm not blaming NATO. I just said it's Putin's
You
fault.
always are blaming
Putin
NATO.
drove-
You're saying,
I
oh,
just
it's
said-
always the West's fault.
I just said Putin
Not
drove those
always.
countries into NATO. I think you need to listen more closely, my
I've
friend.
been listening very
I just
closely
said
to what you're
Putin
saying,
drove those
and
countries
you're
into
making.
NATO.
Hold on, the crux
I
of
said
the
this is a
matter.
big fuck up with Putin. He did not think about this clearly.
Carl, you see, this is your
he
issue.
thought NATO would be divided
when
up.
you speak, you want to be heard, when I speak, you want to speak over
No,
me.
because my friend, first of all, you don't listen properly to what I'm saying.
I listen to every single
Everybody
point you
here,
make.
did I just say that Putin, that
Not just.
NATO
You
was to
used to say
blame
that
for Finland
before.
and Sweden joining NATO? Or did I say that Putin was
No,
wrong?
you were saying that NATO is to
I said
blame.
Putin
NATO
drove
is to
the-
blame
drove
for the
them, he
Ukraine
drove
war,
them
for
to-
the
Yeah,
war in Ukraine.
that's what I just said. I didn't even bring up Ukraine in that respect.
Delusional.
I'm talking about you talking a while ago, Carl.
Just go to the back of the class. You're
Why?
irritating me. Back of
What
the
class? Are you the teacher
Back of
now?
the classroom. Yes, I'm your
If
teacher.
you're the teacher,
Yes, I'm your
I
teacher.
refuse to learn
Yes,
from
I'm
such a
your teacher.
teacher. This is a
My
teacher that
friend-
does not deserve his
My
job.
friend, you need to teach yourself. I've been reading a wonderful book about the life of Stepan Bandera. It's the only volume actually published that deals with his life in one go right now.
Is it?
Hopefully there's going to be more biographies because he's a fascinating figure. I find him very interesting. Now people say Stepan Bandera wasn't really an anti-Semite. This is relevant, by the way, because there's a cult of Stepan Bandera that is very alive and well today.
Cult.
It's a political cult, and it's very, very well
Political
weaponized in terms of trying to defeat Russia. It's very important to understand the real figure. Who was Stepan Bandera? What was he about? He's from Galicia, son of an Orthodox monk. He was there, Orthodox priest. Stepan Bandera was an incredibly pragmatic individual, and he was deeply anti-Semitic. All right, there's no doubt about
Here
that.
we go.
Stepan Bandera switched his rhetoric from during the Second World War to afterwards to tone down the anti-Semitic remarks. He did.
Okay.
But why? That was for two reasons. First of all, most of the Jews in Ukraine were dead by that point, so he didn't really need to see them as a threat. Second of all, he wanted to appeal to the liberal West to help them come in now that they're at the upper hand, and the Nazis were no longer going to be the guardians, safeguarders of Germany. Now people say, well, so when Stepan Bandera was using anti-Semitic rhetoric, so was he really meaning it, or was he just using it to get the Nazis to help him? Well, whether or not that's the case, weaponizing anti-Semitism, capitalizing off the anti-Semitism of a supposed ally is anti-Semitic. I see that as deeply anti-Semitic. To try and make use of an anti-Semitic sentiment in another country, the Nazi government no less, to try and help your cause in Ukrainian liberation, I see that as fundamentally anti-Semitic, and I don't think that's a radical position to take. I think that would be the position of even mainstream Zionist organizations today. They wouldn't look kindly on that at all.
What's that mean?
Excuse me?
What's the anti-Semitic mean?
Well, I can find you. There are documents in this book. I highly recommend it. I forget the author's name now. I think he's Hungarian. It's a book that deals with the life and times of Stepan Bandera. You can download it online. There's a very good website called bok.org. You can download nearly any book you want for free online, or you can buy the book of Amazon. I highly recommend it.
So it doesn't mean anything.
Piracy is not a crime.
Can I ask a devil's advocate position? I don't know much about the scenario, but I've read the chaps, yeah? If that guy didn't weaponize anti-Semitism and Ukraine just fell to the Soviets, yeah, would that be a tragedy? Would you say, oh, maybe we do need to do
So
that
you- are you
terrible
justify-
action?
Help me
Fine.
understand your question. Are you saying that it might have been the lesser of two evils?
Yes.
Justify
I don't know about that. I have to say, there are other Ukrainian figures throughout history, people like Nestor Makhno, who are more than willing to fight both sides. And they weren't willing to use anti-Semitic rhetoric to try and win over authoritarian. Nestor Makhno, this is the thing, this is one of the reasons Stalin tried to kill so many Ukrainian peasants in that part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. They were deeply anarcho-communist in their sentiment. Maybe they didn't ideologically
They were not
frame it that way.
communists, no.
But they had a
wanted their own
fundamentally
state.
organic, communal, rural life. These people, and a lot of them couldn't read and write. Even Nestor Makhno couldn't read and write for a long time ago.
Very important.
These were people with a deep connection to old rural lifeways, who weren't willing to put up with authoritarian regimes, whether they were dressed in a red flag or dressed in a Nazi swastika flag. They weren't willing either way. Nestor Makhno was willing to die for those principles. Now, when Nestor Makhno went to visit Lenin in the Kremlin, he wrote a fantastic essay on my visit to the Kremlin. He sat opposite Lenin at one point, and he said, "Well, I had to say this man is a revolutionary. There's no doubt about it. But I had to hold." He was trying to negotiate about a ceasefire against the anarcho-communist revolutionaries based in the Ukraine, in the rural villages there. And he said, I had to admire him for his successes in the February Revolution. Having said that, I will never forget the way he tried to stamp out the nascent, organic, deeply rooted anarcho-communist sentiment in Ukraine at the time. That would oppose both fascist and authoritarian communist regimes alike. That is a more honorable Ukrainian position, the position of Nestor Makhno and the Makhnovists.
And he failed in the end.
Whether or not he failed is besides the point.
Is it?
You can fight for freedom and fail. That does not make freedom a dead ideology.
You can have
I
an
stand by
impossible
that.
ideology
you can fight
to
for
implement
freedom and die
fail
for freedom.
and make people die because
You
of
can
it.
fight
And you
for
can have a
freedom and
different
die for
ideology
freedom
that
and not
actually
have freedom,
works,
and still
you
freedom will not
succeed,
die.
and you
Yeah,
save
because
people.
principle
Now, what
is
would you choose?
important.
Britain
You
came
can't
very
change
close to
your
losing
principle.
against
You
the
can't
Nazis
change
in
what?
World War II.
Your principle,
Hey, how you
you
doing,
should
guys?
have a principle.
My what?
Britain came close to losing. If we had lost, would that justify Nazi ideology?
Principles.
Or that
Principles
somehow
are worthless if they don't
denigrate,
work.
the British
If principles do
constitutional
not work
monarchy?
when
Of
put in
course not.
practice, they're worthless. This is
Successful
politics,
revolutionary
and this is your
ideology
biggest
does not
issue,
deny
Kyle.
the successful failure revolutionary ideology.
Principles in the first place.
Principles are worthless if they don't work in practice. That's how it is. Nestor Makhno's principles are worthless.
We have to examine
because
why his
he
revolution
had
didn't work.
he had a great view, but his ideology was
I'm
flawed.
sorry. This is faulty reasoning, and I'll explain why. It's deeply, deeply faulty reasoning.
We should
You
follow
can
the
fight-
failures, guys.
You can fight for the revolution. People like take someone like Stepan Bandera. Definitely, without a doubt, he wasn't being pragmatic about his cause for Ukrainian liberation, as he called it. All right, he would have died for that gladly. He went to prison for it when the Nazis backstabbed him. Big surprise. Don't know what he was expecting.
Well, he was backstabbing the Nazis.
However,
so-
does that make his project of Ukrainian nationalism faulty? Just because he failed so many times to get it off
but
the
he
ground?
succeeded
Of
in the
course
bigger
not.
picture.
Clearly
Stepan
he
Bandera
hasn't.
succeeded in the bigger
Clearly
picture.
he hasn't, because Ukraine, like Poland, has been the punching bag of both Germany and
Well,
Russia.
you say he hasn't,
since time
but I can
immemorial.
give you proof
sorry,
that
I'm
he
sorry,
has.
that does not denigrate Ukrainian nationalism. There are far better reasons to attack Ukrainian nationalism than pointing at the failures of Ukrainian nationalists in their successes or not. You don't judge an ideology by how badly or how well it's put into practice. All right?
You judge
try
it by
and
the
judge-
results
You try
of the
and judge.
ideology.
No, you don't. You
Yes,
try
you
and
do.
judge an ideology
Yes,
by
you
its
do.
internal
The result of
coherence.
every single socialist system
try
is
and judge
death
it by its
by the
coherence.
millions. The result
The
of
idea of
Stepan
freedom-
Bandera was to stop the
The
Holodomor
idea
in
of
Western
freedom has been
Ukraine.
fought for
The
for
Holodomor
millennia.
did not go to Western
The
Ukraine.
idea of
That's what
freedom,
happened.
the idea of freedom and democracy has been fought for millennia. All right, many times failed, many times successful. But in the times that it failed, no one was going to say
When was socialism
freedom and
successful?
freedom and democracy are not valid ideals.
No, hold on. When was socialism successful?
There are many examples I could give
Are
you.
there?
I've spoken
One
about
example,
at
go.
Speaker's Corner. I've spoken about anarcho-syndicalist Spain. I've spoken about the Yugoslavian socialist organization of factories. I've spoken about the successes of Cuba, while also pointing out its failures. You have to be analytical when it comes to ideologies like socialism. If you want to make the ideology of socialism broader, you could say Britain was a classic example of a successful socialist country after World War II, when we implemented social democratic policies that defeated unemployment, that nationalized steel, nationalized railways, nationalized mines, putting that in the service of the people rather than the service of profiteers. Now, maybe they did it because they had to rebuild quickly, and then maybe later they decided, no, we're going to have free market principles again now. But there's no denying it. Even mainstream economists like Ha-Joon Chang, who works for Cambridge University, he's pointed out that was the golden age of capitalism in Britain, when Britain implemented heavy democratic socialist policies like nationalization, like controlling unemployment, like direct intervention into the monetary system. I'm talking here about the period 1940s, 50s, 60s, early 1970s. This all came to an end in the oil shock in 1977, which destabilized the global economy and then brought America off the gold standard. This is the kind of socialism that I actually support. You can support a whole range of socialist policies that don't have to be either authoritarian, democratic, libertarian. There's a whole range. Now, I've answered his question so well that he's leaving.
Now he's.
Okay, get up and speak.
I'm
Go,
joking.
it's your
I'm
turn.
joking. You
Get
go.
up and
No,
speak.
go.
Get up and speak.
Dude, this guy has attacked me. This guy has attacked me. You know, call the
Give me
police.
speak. It's your turn.
Call the police. Yeah, sure. When I ask you the
Get up and
questions
speak.
in the
Come on,
moment, you
Get
don't
up
want to
and
answer.
speak. Get up and speak.
All right, let's speak. Thank you. No need for the applause before the speech. Only after, if you
Are we
like.
allowed to boo?
Only after, if you like.
No, you're allowed
So
to
I'd like to start with what Kyle said about the Ukraine situation and about whether or not the West should supply Ukraine with weapons. Now, the first point and the main point in this whole situation is that there was a treaty made, and that treaty is called the Budapest Memorandum, and that treaty is about the biggest nuclear demilitarization in human history.
1994.
I don't remember exactly the year.
Ukrainian got rid of the nuclear weapons.
The Budapest Memorandum. The Ukrainians have
Ukrainians
dismantled
got
their nuclear
dismantled
weapons.
all
Yes.
the-
Yes, the Budapest Memorandum.
I think it was 1994 or 1995. Yeah.
The date, the exact date doesn't matter.
Okay,
What does matter is what was agreed upon in this specific treaty. And what was agreed upon is that the Russians have promised to not intervene with Ukraine and to not violate Ukrainian borders. But it was not only with Ukraine, it was also with Belarus and with Kazakhstan. They also made part of the Budapest Memorandum, and they also demilitarized their nuclear weapons.
But also the West agreed on this.
Agreed to
on
help
the-
Ukraine in case Ukrainian borders were being violated by Russian aggression, which
were
they
going to
are
be
right
buffer
now.
zones.
And thus the West is doing not even the West, the UK and the US, they were the part of the Budapest Memorandum, not all the Western countries. And thus what they're doing right now is only according to the Budapest Memorandum. They're doing exactly what they promised to do. So to ask them not to do it goes against the agreement that they've made to Ukraine beforehand about this situation. And once again, we speak about the war in Ukraine. How are the Ukrainians supposed to fight for their existence if they do not get weapons to fight for themselves, for their country, for the maintenance of their borders, for their ability to exist as a separate entity to Russia? It's impossible. Go on.
Do you think geopolitical actions of the West have flared up Russia at all?
If they flared up Russia at all,
Yeah, the geopolitical movements of the West and NATO, have they flared up Russia
what
at all?
exactly do you mean? The
I have
expansion
no
of NATO?
I have no idea. No idea. He knows a lot
I mean,
more than I
you
do.
need to specify a little bit. But I assume you're talking about the expansion of NATO. Now, what has NATO done to Russia? Absolutely nothing. The only thing that NATO has done, you can laugh, you can laugh. You can laugh. No, but let me answer that. Let me answer that. The Warsaw Pact was gone at that point.
Yeah, they got into all the.
Into the Russian influence. What NATO did was to keep their doors open so that the countries who would like to join them could join them.
Can I just point out?
I don't think that's a
They
crime.
didn't do it
I
to
don't think
Ukraine.
that's doing
They
anything
didn't do it
wrong.
to Ukraine for a long time. Ukraine for the Americans was off the table.
Do you think
They
the
were happy
US
to
are going
expand
to
to
allow
Poland, but
Russian
they didn't.
bases?
Ukraine was off the table for a number of years.
It still was
It's
before
only,
this war
It's
started.
only very recently that Ukraine is out. The NATO wanted
Because
to join.
Ukraine was getting attacked by Russia, and Ukraine needs
It's a cycle.
protection
It's a
from
cycle.
Russia.
I know, it's a
It's not a cycle. It's an attempt of Ukrainians
thinking
to
in a linear
defend
way.
themselves, from a foreign aggressor who has a lot more power than the Ukrainian
Do you think
military
Russia
has.
sees that way, that NATO is a foreign aggressor?
It doesn't matter how Russia sees
Why
it.
doesn't it matter?
Hold
Why
on,
doesn't it
stop,
matter?
stop. I'll tell you
Why
why
does it
it
only
doesn't.
matter
I'll
what you
tell
think
you why it
about
doesn't.
Russia?
I'll tell you why it doesn't matter. I'll explain to you why it doesn't matter. If I go to this gentleman right here, and I steal his phone, we don't try to negotiate with me to give back the phone.
If you have
call
nuclear
the
weapons,
police,
yeah, you do
and the
negotiate.
police- You don't
Sorry,
try and
if you had
negotiate.
nuclear
You
weapons,
call
I would
the police
negotiate.
And you tell me, give back his phone because you stole the phone from him.
If you were a giant guy like massive muscles, I think I would negotiate with you. I'm sorry. I hate to say it, I would.
You
That's what
should
Russia is.
rather call the police. And right now in
Exactly,
this
call the
situation,
United Nations,
right?
yes.
Well, there you go.
Right now,
the
they're not
United-
really doing a good job in Ukraine.
Ah,
I
okay,
agree,
hold
I
on.
agree.
So he doesn't like what the
But that
police is
doesn't mean-
doing.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and use as much.
If the police is corrupt.
Mate, your
Well,
umbrella
the
has
police,
holes in it, mate.
even if the police is
Umbrella has holes in it.
Exactly, it's like the Boris Johnson's umbrella.
But hold on a second. Even if the police is
gonna
corrupt,
get wet,
you
mate.
still need the police to maintain law and order. You still need the police to stop thieves.
If the police
This
is
order.
biased.
This guy has a question. He has a question.
No, ask the question. Ask the question.
No, he's shy. He's shy.
I was going to ask a question. Would the US accept Russian bases in Canada or Mexico?
Exactly.
Would Canada want Russian bases in their lands?
It's a hypothetical.
Mexico would
It's
not want it.
hypothetical.
It's a hypothetical that won't work.
They didn't allow the in the Soviet Union times. They didn't allow
In Cuba.
they didn't allow the missiles in Cuba. So why would they now allow NATO in Ukraine?
Exactly.
Ukrainians have asked to join NATO after the latest escalation in this war. At that point, Russia had violated every single treaty and every single agreement that they had made with Ukraine. No, hold on. It doesn't matter if you're
There's a
pro-Russian or
reason
not.
why they went into
Yeah, there's a
Ukraine.
reason, because the Russians have invaded Ukraine.
Yeah.
And before that,
Because
Ukraine
they
was
don't
not
want
part
to
of
join
NATO.
NATO.
No, Ukraine was not planning to join NATO before the war started in
They
2014.
were planning.
No, they weren't. NATO was
They
refusing.
wanted to join the EU and
They were,
Exactly.
yeah, they wanted to
Ukraine
join the
wanted
EU.
Not
yeah.
even join the EU.
They-
Ukraine
that's what they
wanted to have
CIA
close
Who doesn't want
economic
it? CIA
relations
was
with the EU.
already-
I support that.
That's what they suggested. Hold on, just a second. And they suggested we should have closer relations with the EU. Yanukovych agreed to that. He said, yes, we're going to have closer relations with the EU. But when he became president, he did a U-turn and he said, no, we're going to have closer relations with Russia. People were outraged. They wanted Yanukovych to go back. They overthrew Yanukovych because he was shooting peaceful protesters. He hired his goons to shoot those protesters. And you know, Kyle obviously will blame Great Britain for selling those weapons, but those weapons were not sold to a dictator. They were sold to a democratic leader before he started shooting peaceful protesters. So I don't think Britain is to blame in this situation. But what actually matters in this situation is that Russia has promised to not invade Ukraine. Russia has made plenty of treaties, plenty of promises, plenty of agreements, and Russia has violated every single one of them. In fact, Russia has invaded Ukraine with no declaration of war at 2014, and again, a month ago, a bit more than a month ago, 2014, that's when the war started.
Are you talking about the Donbass region or Crimea?
Donbass and Crimea both happened in 2014.
Now Russia on their is obstacle.
After
Russia,
in Crimea, yes, it was Russia. But in the Donbass,
world domination,
It was both.
global and
It was both of them. There were plenty of Russian troops in Donbass at that point.
global empire.
You're wrong.
That's all they are.
Yeah, they're looking business.
Poroshenko, yes.
Making money.
Poroshenko, yeah, the ex-Ukrainian president.
George Bush's
He had a
father,
whole
senior
collection
Bush.
of Russian
You know
passports
what he
that were
said?
collected from the dead Russian soldiers in Donbass. How did those people get there? Because Russia was sending their own troops to arm and to teach the eastern Ukrainian rebels to fight against Ukraine. And now what did Russia do? Russia violated Ukrainian borders in 2014, and now Russia violated Ukrainian borders once again when they did this brazen invasion into Ukraine, which they already lost in the northern front, and soon they're going to lose it in the eastern front and in the southern front too. And that's exactly why Ukraine is winning the war. Ukraine
I'm going to hold you to that.
you should remember it.
When you're-
Because I was saying
You're here
Ukraine
next
would,
month, I'm gonna-
I was saying Ukraine would win this war weeks ago. Weeks ago. I can't say that. I don't have the knowledge to say that.
Printing paper. And they control the money.
I can't make you a promise when this war is going to end. How am I supposed to explain it?
Heroic
Hold on.
rhetoric is
Wait a
cheap.
second, wait a second.
Very cheap,
Carl,
very easy.
what do I have in my
I don't know
left
which
pocket
country
right
you came
now?
from, but,
Nope, not in this one.
57
You're wrong.
57 Muslims.
Well, there we go. This is the same kind of a the same kind of a question.
I'm still guessing.
United
He didn't
States
say
have
you
a
could
base,
guess.
all of them.
See, I got, yeah,
They
you got
bring
your
the
house keys in there.
dictator, the king, sultan. If they don't like it, oh, you
Can I
know,
ask a
democratic
question?
like
This is
Saddam. Boom, boom, boom.
What do you think? I mean, you know
He's
how
all
we've
about
shut
the
down a
plan
lot of
and
Russia
then give it to
today.
the enemy, and he
Very good.
was
What do
a
you now
dictator.
think about the some of
First
this
they give
information
him
that's come out on the
yeah,
other side?
they give him
Weapons,
weapons,
they give him,
a lot of,
and then next day he's
there's a
the
lot of
dictator. He's very
propaganda
bad.
that's
Let's
come
kill
out.
him.
Not
It's
only
been promoted on the
that,
other
the
side.
one she
What do you
died.
think about the
Because
I always thought the deal to Kiev was
Manipulation.
more of a meme. It was never really that serious. It was basically, look, it was basically talking about a fighter jet in Ukraine, you know, a plane pilot who had a few
She
kills
gave a green light
of
to
the
Saddam,
Russian,
take the
you know,
Kuwait,
Russian
because
planes.
America
And it
was
was
looking for
unclear
excuse
how many
to
kills he
attack
had. It was
Iraq.
unclear
So
what he
when
did, but it was just
they were
a
saying
relatively
that as soon
successful
as
plane
Saddam
fight. I think
went
that's
to Kuwait,
legit
because
information.
America
It is a
said,
guy
"I
who had
give
some
you
kills and
$89
blah blah blah.
billion
But
of
I don't think he had like
weapons,
dozens of
everything. I
kills.
need the
I
money
don't
back.
think he went to bomb
Saddam
Moscow
said,
or
"No, I've been
whatnot,
fighting
or what the
8
memes
years. I
say.
don't have the money.
It was
Wait,
reality
I'll sell my
turned
oil.
into a meme.
Saddam was
Same with the
fighting for them
Ostriv's
against Iran.
where the Ukrainian
Saddam
troops
was their puppet.
told the
They
Russian
should
ship
fight
to fuck
against
off.
Iran.
And then, you know, they
Saddam
were in
was
prison, they
brought
were
there
taken
by
back in
CIA
a prisoner exchange.
1975.
It's kind of memes, man. You're
understand?
bringing memes
So
to the
they
table.
use
You're
him.
saying there's
They make him a
misinformation.
dictator. They never
Wait, wait,
complain
wait,
that.
wait,
They
wait,
never
wait.
said he's undemocratic, nothing. Until
He's a dictator. Yeah.
they take the Kuwait and give it, pay us our money. It was a trap. Saddam took the Kuwait. One
And
week
I
later,
think this is a
Stay neutral and not join NATO. There's been a big push not to join NATO. They've never wanted to join.
There's been a big push from Europe for Ukraine to not join NATO and not join the EU.
Sweden and Finland have always never wanted to join NATO, which was, I think, quite wise.
now they want to.
Now they want to, but how come Ukraine historically didn't just?
I can't hear you. You need to speak loud.
How come historically Ukraine didn't want to not join NATO like Finland and?
Because Ukraine was afraid of Russia. Because Russia has oppressed Ukraine for a lot of its
so he
history.
said,
With
why
Catherine the
this
Great,
NATO?
He
with
wanted to
you know
join
the
European
destruction of
Union.
the Zaporizhian
Putin
siege
at
by the
the
Russian
beginning,
Empire,
in the first 4 or 5
with the
years,
Soviet
he
Union.
wanted
Russia
to
has
join
a
the European
history of
Union.
oppressing
And
Ukraine,
1890,
and they almost
1890,
exterminated the Ukrainian people during the Holodomor.
The Russians are assholes.
Absolutely.
Jackasses.
Absolutely.
Ad hominem. Ad hominem.
They're assholes.
Ad hominem, my friend.
No, no, he's right.
Is he Russian?
No, he's not. He's not.
If he is slave now. Nieta.
What are you, McCarthy? Come on.
Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back to the conversation, guys.
If I come as
I can literally not hear you, man. Seriously.
Finland also felt threatened for decades. They felt yes, they had a similar situation, maybe not as bad. But
Not nearly as bad.
Not nearly as
Russia
bad.
never tried to exterminate the Finns.
But do you not think Finland, the Finns had a point in wanting to stay neutral? Do you not think, because they realised it might escalate the situation?
Yeah, but the situation is different. Now the Finns don't want to stay
Now,
neutral
now,
anymore.
I mean,
yeah,
like-
because the Finns see that Russia is an expansionistic power, and they don't care about international agreements.
I support Ukraine fully.
No
but I
problem.
just wonder, maybe a policy of neutrality when it came to NATO would have not got us in this
Yeah.
situation. For decades, since 91, since 89 or
Hold on a second. A policy of neutrality to NATO implies Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Ukraine didn't join NATO. So what are we talking about? But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many times Ukraine knocks on
Asked
the
to
door.
join it, and the Americans wanted them to join. 2 months
doesn't-
before
it
the
doesn't-
invasion.
matter at all.
2 months before the invasion.
No, but hold on. What's the reason for Ukraine wanting to join NATO?
Look, it has to do with Crimea, but Crimea
No, what's
itself
the-
has to do with NATO wanting
What's
to
the
join NATO.
reason why Ukraine wanted to
I just
join
said
NATO?
it's to do with Crimea, but it also
Crimea.
has to do with NATO as well. Yeah, of course. Do you think that Russia likes to be encircled by military bases? United States
Do you think
military
Ukraine likes to
bases?
be encircled by Russia?
Of course not.
Exactly.
But I'm sorry.
So hold on. Why are we putting the Russian interests on a higher position than the Ukrainian interests? Yes, you are. Ukraine was always surrounded by Russia. Belarus was an ally of
that's the
Russia.
reality of
Crimea
superpower
was
politics.
occupied.
Or the
Oh,
only
but
business
that's
they can
that's the
besides
reality of
petroleum
international
is
politics.
weapons.
Russia
Yes.
is just surrounded
They're
by
one
the
of the
West.
big- and the biggest
Nothing can be done
pieces
about
of
it.
the US
So we should just
is
forget about what Russia
Russia's,
wants.
Russia was surrounded by the West, but it's not like Russia surrounds Europe or Russia
Russia
surrounds
surrounds
America.
Ukraine, and the West surrounds Russia.
So that we
It doesn't surround
It had
Ukraine.
all its troops on the border.
Hold
but
on,
that
hold on.
doesn't mean
I
it's
will
surrounded.
disprove this point
Now
right
it
now.
does.
I'll disprove this point right
Now
now.
you're right, it does. But it
No, I'll
doesn't-
disprove this point right now. Even before the war in 2014, Russia was already surrounding Ukraine. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. First of all, because Russia has the biggest land border of any other country with Ukraine. That's the first point. Let me finish. That's the third point. That's the first point. Russia has a very big land border with Ukraine, so it's already surrounding Ukraine from the northeast and from the east, from the northeast and from the east. Second point: Russia had a lot of its fleet in Crimea before even the war started, because Ukrainians allowed it, because Ukrainians didn't see Russians as a enemy. They saw it as just another country, and we had an agreement that we're gonna let their fleet stay in Crimea. So they had troops there, and that's exactly why Crimea fell so quickly, because Russia was surrounding Ukraine from the south with their fleet, with their troops on their fleet. Third point, Belarus. Belarus has always been a puppet state of Russia. Lukashenko has been a puppet of Putin's. So also from the north, Russia is surrounding Ukraine. That's from the north, from the east, from the south. What remains? The west. What's in the west? Moldova. What does Moldova have? Transnistria. And a not accepted state where there's still Russian troops even now, and there's still a Russian government there, a military government in Transnistria. They still use Soviet machines to drink juice there, even now at this moment. So my point is, Ukraine was surrounded from the south, it was surrounded from the east, it was surrounded from the north, it was surrounded from the west. All sides.
Moldova is only that much border.
It's a considerable border.
No.
Moldova, hold on.
and
Moldova
other
is a small
countries
country,
have
but
more
Moldova
borders.
is a stretched out country. And this stretch,
I know.
Transnistria.
Your country. I'm gonna stretch out your country.
You can joke as much as you want, and you know,
I'm gonna
you might even
stretch
be
you
funny
out, boy.
sometimes.
I had a solution.
Can I get it back
No
on my
homo,
letter?
bro. No homo.
Can
No
we
homo.
get back up later? if you
No,
want.
no homo. Oh, okay, you want to
also-
go. Let me finish with
Yeah,
one
yeah, go
thing.
on, go
I'll
on.
finish with one thing. Let me just finish with speaking a little bit about Stepan Bandera. Stepan
He
Bandera.
has a final solution.
No, I had a solution.
He has
What's
a
going
fi-
on?
He has a final solution for Ukraine.
Speaking of final solutions,
talk to him,
let's
I'm on.
let's talk about Bandera. No, but wait, don't talk to me yet. I'm trying to explain the point about Bandera. Now, what Kyle said about Bandera, part of it is correct, and I'm glad that he finally started to look it up. No, part of it is correct. I'm giving you praise, man. I'm giving you praise, because what you used to tell me before this, it was complete bollocks. You didn't know what you were talking about. Now you know some things what you're talking about. I still disagree with only one point. Bandera was not ideologically anti-Semitic. But what Bandera was doing was that he was catering to the German war machine so that he would get support, he would get training, he would get weaponry against the communists, against the Soviets, because the Soviets were exterminating the Ukrainians at exactly 10 millions, I would say, but it ranges from different. Some people say 15 million, some people say 2 million, some people say 7 million. I say 10 million. That's what we've been told in Ukraine. Anyway, let's keep going about this. So what Bandera actually did, and I think we can see a lot of evidence of this, is that Bandera had the support of the Germans during World War II. That's true, but Bandera was only fighting against the Soviets, only fighting against enemy armies trying to take over Ukraine. Now, here's the very important part of this situation. Bandera tried to betray the Germans when he found out that they never planned to give Ukraine an independent state.
Wow, big surprise.
Big surprise, I know, but he needed their help. He needed their help because the Ukrainians were getting exterminated by the Soviets at that point. So it's like you're fighting with someone who might try to exterminate you in the future against someone who's trying to exterminate you right now. And I think that's a reasonable point. I think that's a very reasonable point. I would much rather side with someone who might backstab me in the future than with somebody who's backstabbing me right at this moment, who's trying to kill me right now. You know what I mean? And it's a similar situation we have right now, honestly. The West might try to backstab us in the future, but Russia has backstabbed us plenty of times, and they're doing it right now.
Can I get up and respond to that?
Last point. I promise. Last point. About Bandera. Just last point about Bandera. And thus, Bandera was sent to jail by the Germans. After the World War II ended, around the end of the World War II, wasn't quite ended at that point. He was allowed to go back to Ukraine, and then he started to fight against both the Nazis and the communists, but against both sides. And there are records, and I showed you this in our conversation on Telegram. There are records of Bandera's troops under Bandera's orders providing the Jews who were trying to escape from the Nazis fake passports to make sure that they were not exterminated. And this is fact. And all of this leads me to believe that no, Bandera was not an anti-Semite. He was only doing so to get the help of the Germans. I'm finished.
So, just because Bandera was jailed by the Nazis doesn't make him automatically not ideologically far-right, anti-Semitic. The Nazis actually jailed an Austro-fascist leader in Austria pretty soon into their expansion into Europe. That they were happy to stab each other in the back. Fascists are not friends with each other necessarily either. So I do think Bandera probably had a decent degree of ideological anti-Semitism as well. Like I said, if someone is happy to weaponize anti-Semitism to help their cause for national liberation, as he called it, then I think they might maybe have a bit of anti-Semitism themselves. That in itself is. But yes, I do think Stepan Bandera was trying to be pragmatic, depending on the situation he was in. Sometimes he tried to appeal to the Nazis, sometimes to the West, depending on the situation. So I just wanted to point that out. That doesn't make Stepan Bandera automatically anti-Nazi just because he was jailed by the Nazis. There was a famous Austro-fascist, I forget his name now, he was also jailed.
When he was here, he was quiet, and now he's going to stand down and not quiet.
You were the one.
No, it's okay, he's got no manners, it's fine. It's fine. Guys, no meetings within a meeting.
Can you move away?
Do you want to get up on the ladder, Judge? Do you want to get up on the ladder?
I think he should. He has an interesting idea for killing all fascists,
but we
but
are
not killing the communists. I think it's interesting. Like, I wouldn't want to just kill everyone. Oh, he's a fascist, kill him. He's a Nazi, kill him. He's a communist, kill him. Kill them all. No, I think there needs to be a bit of a steady-handedness in this idea. You shouldn't just kill people left, right, and center.
I think you mentioned before that you made the analogy. I'd rather work with someone who might stab me in the back later against someone who stabbed me now. I think a better analogy with Ukraine is NATO has been stabbing Ukraine in the back a little bit, and Russia's been stabbing them in the back a lot, and that's tragic. I'll give you the example of Britain's support for Belarus. Britain has actually had, up until recently, been working with the Belarusian army and training them in urban warfare. You can read this on Declassified UK, a very good source of investigative journalists looking at British foreign policy. Britain has been involved in training up troops in urban warfare tactics in Belarus. British PR companies like Bell Pottinger were involved in giving PR, public relations help, to the dictator of Belarus, the last dictator in Europe. All right, Britain, like I pointed out, helped Putin get elected. They got him to go to the opera. They got Tony Blair to go to the opera for public image reasons to try and improve his image. Even as Putin was leveling Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, to the ground, the British elite were happy to help Putin. All right, this is going far back now, 2001, around that time. All right, it's more been a case that Britain and America have been stabbing Ukraine in the back a little bit and and Russia has been stabbing Ukraine in the back a lot. And now, what is the part that I have to play in that? Me personally, and you, if you're British or you live in Britain, consider yourself a citizen in the broader sense. You are more responsible for your own country's actions than you are of the Russian government's actions.
Exactly.
I'll give you the example of Rohingyas. Terrible genocide going on in with the Rohingyas, right? Similar with the Uyghurs in China. Now, I can't do anything to influence the Chinese government on that, all right? I might go and shout at the Chinese embassy, but that's nothing, let's be honest. What I can do is look at my own country's role in these conflicts and try and understand that. I have more influence on my own government and what we're doing, right? Now, we may not live in a real democracy in Britain. I think more and more people are seeing this every day, that we live in more of an aristocracy, monarchy, corporate dictatorship more than anything.
What if your
But
country-
we do have some influence. We are more democratic than Russia is. We've got to use that to the
Exactly.
maximum to look at Britain's role in fomenting this conflict.
Hold on. What if your country is
So
the
that's
lesser
why
evil?
even if Britain was only responsible for 1% of the violence in Ukraine, that would be the 1% that I am primarily responsible for. And that's the balance I want to talk about, focus my energy on. If I came to Speaker's Corner and set up my ladder at 12:15 p.m., and I spoke until 6 p.m. in the afternoon, maybe 7 p.m., which is roughly when it starts to wind down, that's only 7 hours of speaking, all right? That's a lot of speaking, but that's 7 hours. I don't have like all that time during the week to talk about this. I will focus on what Britain's doing. I told you about Britain selling weapons to Yanukovych. You mentioned, well, Yanukovych at that point was friendly to the West, so that's why they sold him weapons. It was only later he turned on the West and sided with Putin.
No, he was friendly to his people. He
No,
wasn't killing his people
at first
that
he was quite friendly to the West. He wanted to join, and then
Both of
he
them.
changed his mind later and he sided with Putin.
Well, yeah,
Now,
he wasn't killing
this reminds me
anyone
of the Falklands.
at that point.
Bin
Sorry,
Laden as well.
this reminds me of Bin Laden. This reminds me of the Falklands. I'm going to give those two examples. Thank you for mentioning Bin Laden. I'll talk to you about him in a second. I'll start by talking about the Falklands. Margaret Thatcher was selling weapons to the Argentinian dictatorship right up until the Falklands attack happened. It was one of the most brutal juntas in South America at the time. Maybe the worst fascist leadership that South America has ever seen. Worse than Pinochet. Thousands of people disappearing, thousands of people giving free helicopter rides. Terrible, terrible atrocities happening. And Britain was happy to sell weapons. Margaret Thatcher was doing everything she could to sell fighter jets, to sell bombs, to sell shells to that regime. And then, yes, the junta turns on us, right? And then they try and claim back Las Malvinas, the Falklands, whatever you want to call them, all right? And then Britain turns on Argentina. Like my good friend Robert, who was here just half an hour ago, said, Britain has no friends or enemies. We just have interests, right? Now, when we say Britain and we say we mean the British elite.
But that's how the
all right?
geopolitics works.
Like I said, the British public on the whole would not be happy if they knew, if there was the full level of education needed about Britain's relationship with Argentina. Now, you mentioned Bin Laden. This little episode in history I'm about to tell you, to the Tony Blair and Bin Laden, this hasn't even gone down George Orwell's memory hole, because it hasn't even been remembered to begin with, all right? You have, in the 90s in London, a green light by the Metropolitan Police to terrorism. I'm getting this research from a historian called Mark Curtis, who used to be a fellow at Chatham House, which is Britain's foreign policy think tank, okay? He's not just a random radical leftist, like me standing on a ladder. Don't take what I'm saying. I'm a guy on a ladder in a park, all right? Don't just take my word for this stuff. Have a look at Mark Curtis's website, check out this information. Back to Bin Laden. Bin Laden had a front set up in London, an office, called the Advice and Reformation Committee. It was a front for Al-Qaeda, no doubt about it. The police know that now, and I think they knew it then as well. Now, what the police had a relationship, what they said was, it was a covenant. They said to the radical Islamists setting up in London, as long as you don't attack on British soil, you can use London as a base for attacking in foreign countries. Now, why did Britain do this? I think they wanted to have some leverage over Saudi Arabia. That is why they allowed Bin Laden to set up here. I think they wanted to have some influence over Saudi Arabia's politics and their relations as well. Saudi Arabia is a whole topic to talk about. I mean, Saudi Arabia's dictatorship makes Putin look like a paradise by comparison.
Not quite.
Saudi Arabia is on another level to Iran and Russia. Now,
You'd be very surprised.
Russia is heading in that direction, but Russia for a long time wasn't nearly as bad as
Russia
Saudi
is
Arabia.
there.
Saudi
Russia has been
Arabia
there for
has
a
been a
long
long-time
time.
friend of Britain. Britain helped to create Saudi Arabia. Now, why did Britain allow this? Like I said, it was. Can you not have a meeting within a meeting? Let's just keep it.
Okay,
let's
hold
just
on,
keep the
Kyle.
discussion
I'm sorry,
going,
I'm sorry,
guys.
but you asked me questions, I answered. I
Right,
ask you
Britain
questions, you
allowed
refuse
Bin
to
Laden.
answer.
Britain allowed Bin Laden to set up his office in London. Did they know that Bin Laden would then
Loves the
turn on
stage,
Britain?
doesn't he?
No, they didn't know that at the time, but they were happy for Bin Laden to carry out his Islamist radical terrorist organization on a global scale. Now, when 9/11 happened, Tony Blair completely changed his position. the Americans put pressure on the Metropolitan Police in London to get rid of all these organizations, send them back to the Middle East, right? However, for a long time, for a decade in the 90s, Britain sent a green light to these terrorists to set up in London. There are multiple examples of this where Britain has basically collaborated with radical Islamist terrorists, seeking a marriage of convenience that'll serve its short-term interest, not worried about British people. People say I'm anti-British. I've got up and spoke about the ways that British people have been harmed by this kind of atrocity, this disgusting kind of unethical foreign policy. I've talked about this for years at Speaker's Corner. The Manchester bomber, who claimed many victims up in Manchester, he was involved in something called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. That's where he got his training. He was there trying to get rid of Gaddafi and set up a radical Islamist regime to replace the more secular, pan-Arabist, kind of socialist regime that Gaddafi had set up. Now, he was given a green light by Britain to go to Libya and fight against Gaddafi. At that time, Britain wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. Gaddafi himself, Britain was happy to be friends with before that, until he turned on the West. Even when Gaddafi was killing his own people, Britain had no problem. It was when Gaddafi turned on the West. Now, this terrorist then used that training, that experience to come back to Britain and to launch an attack on British people. And people say, I'm anti-British for exposing this information. They say I'm anti-British because I'm always criticizing Britain. I'm not criticizing Britain. British people do not want to have a part in this. British people are not happy to have Britain's elites backing these terrorist groups for their own gain. I don't think calling me anti-British is an acceptable form of mudslinging. I deny it and I consider it slander.
Okay, thank you. Fine. Right, Kyle. The world doesn't work the way we want it to work. Sometimes we have two sides fighting, and they are the only two sides. And one of those sides is evil, and the other one is more evil. So in a situation like that, we need to choose the lesser evil, because it's the evil over which we have a higher control. It's an evil that if it wins, it's less bad for humanity. And that's exactly what Stepan Bandera did. That's exactly what the Ukrainians should do. Like, sure, in World War II, did Britain not do anything bad? Of course they did, plenty of things. But compared to what the Nazis did and what the Soviets did, Britain and America are blameless. Because those two parties are on a whole different level.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
You should go. You should
I'm
go.
sorry. This is a classic
You
example.
should go.
I was kind of with you a little bit.
Oh, but
up
hold
until
on
you
a second.
said
Do you
that.
think Britain?
I was kind of with you a little bit. I knew what you were trying to say.
Let me finish.
Go on, then go on.
Thank you.
Listen.
Do you really think that at World War II, Great Britain and the USA were at the same level of evil as Nazi Germany and the USSR?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you very much.
To say that they were blameless, by comparison, I'm quoting you directly.
I'm not saying they were blameless. I'm saying they were far less to blame.
Okay, my friend, maybe you misspoke. Maybe
it's
you
a
meant
metaphor. It's a okay. Hold on, guys.
Oh, you gotta choose your metaphors.
Do you guys
very
understand? Do you guys
carefully,
understand what I mean when I say, in comparison to this, you're blameless? It doesn't mean you're blameless. What it means is you have less blame in comparison to this specific entity that we're talking
I'm sorry, my
I
friend.
think everybody
I think
gets
you've got to
this.
choose your words very carefully.
Yeah,
okay?
like Chomsky when he
Choose
said that
these
Ukraine
words-
should be neutralized.
Choose these
Very
words.
good choice of words.
Choose these words very,
good
very
choice
carefully.
of words.
All right.
I'm
Now-
sorry, but if you don't get a metaphor, then
No,
that's not a.
you got
that's
to
not
choose your
an
metaphors very carefully. Okay.
Okay, here we go.
To say that they were blameless by comparison. All right.
By comparison,
To
yeah.
say that they were the lesser of two evils,
They
I
were.
am with you on that. I am with you on that. Now, I'm going to respond to this in two parts. First of all, that doesn't mean the policy of Britain wasn't evil. Firebombing Dresden, firebombing Americans, firebombing Tokyo, that's evil. That had no even Anglican bishops in Britain were saying that was uncalled for and not a way to defeat the enemy. That if anything, it was going to raise the morale of the Germans.
What should they have done?
After all, when the Germans bombed London, it raised the morale of British people. It didn't break it. It actually made the British war effort stronger. So it's not just evil. It's unpragmatic as well. It's inexpedient. Now, I'll respond to that in the second form. You said they were blameless by comparison. I'm not going to try and strawman you and say that's what you really meant. I think I get what you really mean. I think it was a terrible metaphor to use, but I will now respond to that as if somebody else said it. Somebody else like Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson came out a couple of years ago saying all these people attacking the British Empire. Well, look, we weren't as bad as the Nazis, right? Now, the implication, the unsaid implication, remember, he's using one of Aristotle's enthymemes. You don't say the implication. It's a very classic rhetorical technique. The implication is so heinous, it's so ridiculous, you don't actually say it. You hint towards it, right? This is what a lot of people do in rhetorical discussion. Implications that we're not evil, right? That's just not true. I don't mean the British people. I'm talking here about the British Empire. By comparison with the Nazis, sure, fine.
Well,
But
there we
weren't we
go.
running
Then we
gulags
agree.
in Kenya?
What are you talking
Weren't
about?
we running gulags in Kenya? Running gulags against Afrikaners in South Africa? We were. We were running our own concentration camps. Kenya was even much more recent than South Africa. There are people alive today who actually suffered through that and are trying to campaign to get justice from the British government for that. People like Barack Obama's grandfather was tortured by the British officials in one of those gulags in Kenya. If you want to read more about this, you should read Caroline Elkin's work on the subject. It's fascinating. So Britain had its own concentration camps. It has its own dark side to its history that we have to examine. Does this make you anti-British to do this? I don't think so. Does it make you pro-British? Not necessarily. What it does is it makes you someone willing to look at the dark side of your country's civilization, their history, willing to bring it to light when these aren't discussed. Now, you can start to come up and say, oh, this is not how the world works. Unfortunately, the world is very, very difficult. Lesser of two evils. You have to be pragmatic.
Well,
Fine, you can do this, but we have to do it with the proper information. And the media system we have doesn't do that.
Have I told you
It doesn't
something
bring
that's
up the proper information into the mainstream. Like I mentioned, Britain working with Belarus, training up soldiers in urban warfare. This is not published in the BBC, not in any mainstream source.
Britain also trained
fact
the
that-
Egyptian
the
military,
fact that-
the Jordanian military.
Sure.
At
Britain
at
trains lots of dictatorships.
Arab-Israeli
Britain
wars.
works lots of dictatorships.
And then Britain also
in the
contributed to the
Iran-Iraq
Israeli
war,
cause.
in the
Britain
Iran-Iraq
contributed
war,
to both
Britain was
causes to an
selling
extent.
weapons to both sides. Again, a fact in history not brought up, not discussed properly.
Can you bring this back to Ukraine and Russia? How does this all
I will bring it back to Ukraine and Russia. Now, we can look at the things I'm saying and say, look, oh, I think maybe Britain was justified in that. Maybe they had this thing in mind. But that's not even the fundamental point I came to make. I just came here to share the information. It is not shared. That's the fundamental point I'm making. This is stuff that is not adequately discussed in the British propaganda system, in the media system we live under. Whether it's the liberal media like BBC, Guardian, or whether it's the right-wing media, which is mostly not worth reading.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the Daily Mail and so on. They're
It's
just
pretty funny though,
80%
like the
not worth reading.
the Daily Mail. I was thinking of the
Whether
Daily
it's-
Stormer.
Whether it's
pretty
those,
funny.
whether
the-
it's
the
those
stupidities they
mainstream
say.
sources, you will not hear the kind of context adequately discussed like I'm trying to do now. And I'm not even the only one. There are many people, independent journalists, trying to do this. People like Mark Curtis, John Pilger, organizations like Media Lens, which I highly recommend you check out their website. They're trying to look at Britain's role in this conflict. And yes, it is a provocation to drive NATO to have Ukraine. It is. A gentleman who's now sadly not here, he left. He said, well, imagine if Russia had put nuclear weapons in Mexico or Canada. You say, well, oh, Canada hasn't done that. But it's a thought experiment, isn't it? It's a way to try and think around this problem and try and see it from the Russian side. That would be I think if Putin had somehow put a military base in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, I can assure you Britain would do far more than what Putin's done to Ukraine. Britain would do far more. They'd level Ireland.
Oh, they would
If
threaten
if
nuclear
had to,
war and they
they'd be
would
happy
invade
to.
Ireland.
Britain would be happy
I
to.
find that hard to believe.
Britain was happy to work with the UDR in Northern Ireland, machete, club-wielding, balaclava men that were storming into Southern Ireland on terrorist sprees. So they were happy to do that. They'd be happy to do a lot more if somehow Putin
Wait,
was,
is that
was
more than
training up
nuclear
troops,
threat?
working with
Is that
people
really
in
more than
Ireland.
testing nuclear weapons and saying I'm going to use these if you push me to the corner?
Look, like I pointed out,
People with balaclavas and
America's
machetes, you're comparing them to
America
nuclear
has
war.
been,
Are you
America's
serious?
used nuclear weapons just as many times as Russia, if not more. They've actually dropped them.
No, they dropped them.
Not only that,
That's
but like I
true.
pointed out, Henry Kissinger used nuclear weapons in diplomacy to do with Vietnam. This is where I say, oh, United States, USSR, one side is blameless by comparison. Maybe the metaphor didn't get conveyed the way you wanted it to, but I think that
Not for you.
that betrays what John McMurtry called the ancient taboo, the oldest taboo of civilization. You do not, this is the taboo, you do not examine your own country and your own civilization with the same critical eye with which you examine another country's. And if that country is somehow in conflict with yours, then you give it even more of a bias. You're even less likely to examine your own country's role. This is why I came up to Speaker's Corner, talk about Britain helping Putin get elected. Working, like not only did Tony Blair go to the opera with Putin as he was genociding the Chechens, Tony Blair came out later and he said, I think I understand the Russian position better than most countries do. Saying how the Chechens were involved in terrorism and so on. Similar argument used in Turkey with the Kurdish. And Turkey's another NATO country that have just gone and started bombing northern Iraq now. This is a NATO country. All right, this is not. I don't think we have to make this like a Marvel sort of type movie where one side is the good guys, one side is the bad guys. We just got to kill the bad guys, and then we'll be happy. that might be very satisfying.
We could make it
that might
into
be
a
very
situation
satisfying
one side is
emotionally,
better,
right?
the
When you're
other
watching a
side is
movie,
worse.
when you're watching one of these popcorn movies, which by the way have a lot of entanglement with the Department of Defense in America, many of them. That might be very satisfying emotionally, but that is not how international politics works. All right, I'm not here to even to say whether or not Britain should have done those things, working with Putin, right? Selling weapons to Putin, doing all this stuff in the run-up to this invasion. I'm just here to bring up this information so you can go home and think about it. This is the kind of thing that needs to be discussed in the mainstream.
Do you think, had we disbanded NATO after the Cold War, do you not think Putin would have done what
There
he
were
did?
many options after the Cold War ended. Many options put on the table. Charles de Gaulle put up the option earlier before NATO even set up in earnest. Charles de Gaulle was saying, why don't we have a non-military bloc, including Russia, including Europe, non-military, no military formations organized against each other. The Russians themselves promoted this idea. They said, we will happily move towards a non-military bloc from Vladivostok to Lisbon. That's what they were saying. Even the Americans had their own version of this. Discussed at high level, American strategic planners discussed this. NATO was not inevitable. NATO was set up in the end, right, to keep, this is what a famous English historian has called it, to keep the Germans down, to keep the Russians out, and to bring the Americans in. It is a tool of American imperialism. All right. Now, if you get a knee-jerk reaction to hearing those two words together, American imperialism, you somehow think that, I'm not saying this necessarily, thinking that
I'm not saying anything.
that America is not as blameless as Russia is more blameless
It's not.
by comparison with the USSR. You have to look at the history. You have to dig it up.
Yes, you do.
More than 3 million dead in Vietnam, under
20 million dead because of Stalin.
The most serious like use of firepower and destruction on a country since World War II. All right, that's just Vietnam. That is just Vietnam. We could stop there and say that's
That's just
horrendous
his own
enough.
country.
And that should be a
Over
cause to examine your own country.
10 million just in Ukraine.
And be very careful before you use metaphors like we are blameless by comparison.
Here we go.
More than 1 million dead in Latin America due to American-backed fascist, third world fascist dictatorships in Latin America. I could talk about the United Kingdom. I could list these off for hours, my friends. I really could. I could talk about
I
Britain.
could list the exterminations of communist regimes for
that's
hours.
whataboutism. I could talk about Britain involved in.
whataboutism,
I could
okay,
talk about Britain's involvement in
We're
helping Idi
comparing
Amin come to
the
power.
two ideas. right now, aren't
MI6
we?
helping Idi Amin come to power in Uganda, full knowing what kind of character he had. MI6 working, like I said, with Vladimir Putin, full knowing what kind of character he had. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International were already telling us how dangerous Putin was, how violent he was in Chechnya. MI6 was happy to work with him. I could talk about Britain's involvement in the Nigerian civil war against Biafra, 1960s. More than 1 million people dead. British people who are old enough to remember that would remember seeing in the Sunday Times and the newspapers pictures of Nigerian Biafran children starving because of the blockade the federal military government of Nigeria did on that part of eastern Nigeria. They will remember the pictures, but will they remember the British was heavily involved in selling tanks, weapons to the Nigerian government to carry out that invasion of that part of that country?
Deviated again.
They will not remember that because it wasn't
We
even
should bring it back
discussed
to
to begin
Ukraine
with.
and Russia. That's what you've been asked.
The whole day long.
It's
We
not
could
what
the
if.
whole day
My
long.
friends, I'm here to
Everything
try and
comes
promote a
from the
distrust of
personal
NATO. To try and
perspective.
promote a skepticism of NATO, that the same skepticism you are rightly applying, all of you, to Putin, all right, and his motives, you should be applying to NATO. You can call this whataboutism. I personally
It
think
is.
90% of the time when people say whataboutism, it's a form of silencing dissent against this war.
What about this
No,
is silencing
10% of the
dissent?
time,
That's exactly what it is.
10% of the time, this is how it strikes me. 10% of the time, I think they are right to call out whataboutism. There are both elements on the far left and the far right, which are now trying to justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine by pointing to NATO atrocities. Well, look what NATO did to Libya. 40,000 people dead
like
in
you,
Libya.
what-
Now
kind of
look,
like what you're doing.
that's whataboutism. When you try and use that to justify the Ukraine attack, that is whataboutism. I agree with that, and that should be called out. Russian propaganda is just as bad as Western propaganda. There's no doubt about it.
It's not just
we
as
have
bad,
to,
it's worse.
We have to
No,
look
not
at both
worse.
sides.
They're not worse.
We have to look at both
It's
sides.
absolutely
It's the
worse.
same.
It's
It's the
absolutely
same.
worse. You can say it's the same as much as you want. The Russian media was saying that they would never invade Ukraine the day before they invaded Ukraine at night with no declaration of war. That's the latest atrocity that the Russians have committed. And we're supposed to believe that the Western propaganda is as bad as Russian propaganda. I'm sorry, I don't see people in the West being put in jail by the hundreds and by the thousands for years and then getting raped and tortured in jail. I don't see any of that. It's absolutely like that
No,
in Russia.
if anything, I think Western propaganda is probably more effective. Whether or not it's bad or worse in terms of quality.
But we're not debating the
I find it
effectiveness,
probably
we're debating
I think it's probably
ruthlessness.
more effective. Russians who live under the Putin regime, they may have varying levels of support for Putin, but they're fully aware of the level of propaganda you see in Russian society. Chinese people as well. Chinese people, many of them are fully aware of how 1984 leveled their status. But the propaganda we live in under the West, a lot of us are not even aware it's propaganda. You have people like Andrew Marr coming on and saying in his memoirs, saying, oh, when I started to work for the BBC, I had my organs of opinion officially removed. That's what he said. He said it's a non-biased structure, it's non-biased. Within a few months, he was calling on Britain to level Serbia, to attack its civilian infrastructure. He was calling on NATO to commit atrocities against Serbia, saying we have to, like a British admiral said at the time, we have to pounding and keep pounding. There was even a British politician or a journalist, I can't remember which, saying at the time, said we should send the Serbians back to 1385. That's what he said. He said you want to do 1920, we'll send you back to 1920.
Kyle, I'm sorry,
you want
I
to do
have to ask you a
1385,
question.
we'll send you back to 1385.
I have an important question to ask you.
So if anything, Western propaganda I find is more insidious.
I have a
Because
very
even
important
Westerners,
question.
many of them are not aware
I
that
need
they
to
live
ask
under
him
this
right
level.
now. There's a very important question. Am I allowed to ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
But if you're going to start speaking, I prefer you to get on the ladder. I don't want
I'll
to.
go on the
I don't want to have a debate like that. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm okay with people asking me questions, and I'm perfectly fine with answering them like this. I don't know